So one thing I did want to talk to you, Deke, was about I just did a video on rock and roll history, and my theory from like 1959 to 1969, I've never think of rock and roll changing as much as it did in those 10 years. And basically, I started at Buddy Holly, and I ended at Jimi Hendrix and at Woodstock. And to me, like, the look is totally different, and the sound is totally different. But from like 69 on to now, like guitar music, it hasn't really changed that much, really. You got Eddie Van Halen and all this other stuff, but still, like in those 10 years, it just jumped leaps and bounds. And I was just wondering, what is Deke Dickerson? Why do you think that happened in those 10 years? What made the music change so much from 1959 to 1969?
Well, I've thought about this not only in terms of music, but just in terms of everything else. And, first of all, I'll say that 1959 to 1969 had a definite, maybe the biggest change of any 10 years in American history. But if you look at 1949 to 1959, man, it was almost as big.
Really?
Just in terms of, the music in the late 1940s, yeah, there was some hip blues and rhythm and blues and hillbilly going on, but that was pretty niche. The stuff that was popular was like really mainstream, bland kind of stuff. And by the end of, by 1959, you had all this wild rock and roll, and the entire musical landscape had changed. I mean, all the old performers had basically been put out of business by 1959 because of rock and roll.
Yeah.
And I guess what I'm trying to lead around to is that I think a lot of it has to do with the technological innovations that happen, because certainly what happened between 1949 and 1959 was you had all these technological innovations with electric guitar. Electric guitar, started in even by 1949, it was basically like an archtop guitar with a floating pickup and, a tiny little amp. And by the end of the 1950s, you had solid body guitars, Fender Stratocasters and Gibson Flying Vs, and you had things like the Tweed Twin, which was a massive 100-watt amp with two 12-inch speakers that could literally, curl your hair, if you turned it up loud enough. Yeah. And so getting back to your question specifically about 1959 to 1969, there was a sea change of technological innovation that happened in those 10 years. If we're just going to talk about guitar, you had reverb come out, which first started appearing on amps around 1959, 1960. You had amps getting much bigger. Fender came out with their Showman amplifiers and their dual Showman amplifiers, then followed by amplifiers like the first Marshall amps that came out. By the end of the 1960s, you've got these Marshall full stacks, and guys like Jimi Hendrix are using like 8 of them, and if you can imagine like 8 Marshall full stacks all on 10, if you compare that to what they had in 1959, it's like there was nothing like that in 1959. Yeah. And same goes with bass and drums and keyboards and PA systems. One thing we don't ever really talk about is, I remember talking to Scotty Moore about when they first started playing to 10,000 screaming females in these arenas with Elvis Presley. And he said, there would literally be like a microphone hanging from the ceiling that would be the same mic that they would use for wrestling matches and for cattle auctions. It was like there was no public address system. It was just this very crude, like one microphone that was like a horn or, maybe a couple of speakers if you were lucky. And, by the end of the 1960s, you had something like the Woodstock PA system, which was insane. You know what I mean? It was like these huge line array speakers, like hundreds of speakers pointing out at, hundreds of thousands of people with these thousands of watts of PA amplifiers behind them. So I think the main thing when it comes to music is the technological change. Because, you're just going to play music a certain way when the only thing that you have is a, Fender Stratocaster and a Tweed Deluxe, and maybe you've got a reverb unit. you're just going to play a certain way. But if you have a Les Paul with a Marshall stack, and then a bunch of pedals, like fuzz pedals and whatever else, wah-wah pedals, and a giant PA system to boot, you're just going to play a different way. The music is going to come out differently. And I think that's exactly what happened. I mean, even if you trace it from surf music to the Beatles, to the Stones, to like the psychedelic era, to finally like, the hard rock, acid rock era.
Yeah.
It's all kind of like lockstep along with whatever technological innovation came up next.
Yeah.
And, it goes along with the recording studios as well, because in the 1950s, you pretty much recorded live to mono tape.
Yeah.
Maybe by the end of the 1950s, you had some studios that recorded on 3-track, which was not really like a multi-track. It was just kind of to separate left, center, right, so that you could mix it a little bit after the recording section. But, by 1964, 1965, you had 4-track machines. By 1967, 68, you had 8-track machines. The very first 16-track machines came in. And, by 1970, 1972, you had 16-track machines and 24-track machines that became like the de facto standard.
Yeah.
And, just the whole way you're going to record a band or a musical act is completely different if you're recording it all live to a mono, 1-track tape machine.
Yeah.
As opposed to like recording to a 24-track machine. So I think that the technological advances really made the most difference in the change in music. But then you've got all these other things that are happening too. And we talked about this briefly before this phone call. Kennedy being assassinated, the Beatles coming in from England, this whole kind of even before psychedelic, there was like sort of like I'm forgetting the word. Is it op art? But they're far out, way out people who were creating art and influencing culture. And I think that stuff definitely influenced the music that was happening at the same time.
Yeah. So and that's great. I figured that you would come in with a technology thing, but I would imagine that's probably true. Like if you're Jimi Hendrix and you have an opportunity to get a lot of feedback, you start playing around with that thing, and then you end up basically inventing a whole new tone. And
yeah.
So like
and I mean, also I'll just interrupt because I remember, I think it's on the back of the first Byrds album, the Mr. Tambourine album. It might be on the back of one of the other albums. But Roger McGuinn talks about how there were planes in the air with propellers, and then they turned into jet planes, and then they turned into supersonic jet planes. And he even talks about like that influenced their music. And so you can't really discount the fact that, if we go back to like right after World War II, sure, there were airplanes, sure, there were cars, but everything was still pretty primitive. And like people didn't have television sets, people didn't have washing machines, and by the time you get to 1969, like pretty much every house in the country has a television set.
Yeah.
Pretty much every house in the country has a car. Pretty much every house in the entire nation is like 1,000 times more technologically advanced than they were right after World War II. And I just think that all of that influenced the music a lot.